even though I would say this band is on the edge of being keyboard driven and analog keyboard driven, that there are all these guitars coming from places that again have a little bit of that Asia-esque thing in. Not every track has the driving rock guitar.
It's a lot of counterpoint.
Yeah, it's a lot of counterpoint.
Right.
And that was Steve Howe.
Right.
You know, Steve Howe did so much counterpoint in Asia, and I think we've kind of brought that along with us with this album.
That's also classic progressive rock. That you have kind of orchestral interweaving.
Well, it is
lines.
orchestral, yeah.
Yes, and it's not just everyone playing the same part or doing just little inversions of the same thing.
Monophonic parts going in.
Yes.
On.
Right.
In it, and that will make up a chord.
And I'm obviously a huge Moog fan. So whether it's my modular Moog or the classic Mini Moog Model D or the newer Voyager. Or even the little Moog Rogue, I think I used that on a few bits. Obviously, those are monophonic instruments, and so you can only play them that way. That in a sense, makes you a lot more creative, because when you're limited by something, you can almost come up with something better, because if you have infinite possibilities, you may just settle on the first thing that you come up with.
Yeah, I mean, most of the great guitarists that I know stick with one guitar for a certain period, and that helps define their sound as well.
I do want to follow up a little bit on a point we touched on earlier, and that's the classic keyboards. And I always like to call them classic keyboards versus vintage keyboards. Obviously they're vintage, they're old, but I continue to use them not because I'm trying to be clever and trying to have some gimmick where I'm using, I use this synthesizer from 1969 or this synthesizer from 1974 or this Mellotron from 1968. I use them because I love the sound of them, and I love the way they sit in an arrangement, and whether they were made in 1969 or 2018 makes no difference to me. It's like the guitarist finding the perfect vintage Stratocaster or vintage Les Paul. I don't think most guitarists like Jeff Coleman, who has an amazing collection, I don't think they buy those guitars because they're old. I think they buy them because they're great.
Yeah.
And that's the approach I've always taken with keyboards. I own, I think, 5 Mini Moogs or something like that. And I use them all. I don't put them on a shelf.
There's got to be nostalgia in there as well, because I've had this thought before, a vintage guitar sounds a certain way, and I think it's driven into us of what a really classic Les Paul or classic Mini Moog sounds like. And then you have all these guitars that emulate it, or software that emulates it, and it doesn't quite connect with the brain the same way. But when you hear, like, some of these tracks, when we demoed them for Dukes of the Orient, we used virtual instruments for the demos.
We did, yes.
And all the classic synths that Eric has in his collection, there are sample libraries, there are virtual instruments that make them, and you use them and you go, oh yeah, that sounds like a Mini Moog. It doesn't quite connect with your brain. All your neurons don't go firing off until you hear the weight of the real thing, and you go, oh crikey, that's a 58 Les Paul.
Right. I ended up, in fact, in 2017, when we finished the album, I ended up replaying a few parts that were fine performances, and the sounds were good, but I knew the 5% difference or whatever the difference was, and I think you even challenged me a few times, like, are you sure you want to replace that? Yeah. I think the solo in Strange Days was a great example, the Mini Moog solo in that. I mean, there was a beautiful sounding solo that was there before that I had done on a soft synth. And I said, well, no, I'd really like to use the real thing. And then I think when I sent it to you, you're like, oh, okay, this is quite a bit better.
And that happened a lot in the last year of this album, that even though we'd got like 3/4 of the way through it, or certainly 50% of the way through it, it was like, well, I don't want it to sound like something, even though it's taken 10 years, that we've got this collection of stuff we'll dust off and put an album out, which is kind of what I did with Archiver, an Asia release, that there were just collections of songs that hadn't been used. This was like, okay, well, that doesn't work now. I don't feel that way lyrically exactly the same. So we basically went back to the skeleton, took off bits that we didn't want and rebuild it a bit, quite a bit. As you said, so much so that, you know, even while mixing, I was re-singing the lyrics and Give Another Reason. Didn't actually, it had a verse that we completely changed.
Yes.
And I'm glad we did.